Hello, everyone. My name is Erika Leal. I'm from Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana. It's my pleasure to close out USENIX Security Symposium. I hope you all have enjoyed it thus far. Today, I'm presenting on the feasibility of malware unpacking via hardware-assisted loop profiling. In this presentation, we will discuss hardware-assisted malware unpacking using loop-centric profiling. We term loop HPC. With the help of built-in registers called hardware performance counters, we harness our loop-centric approach to effectively unpack malware while also minimizing the non-deterministic nature of hardware performance counters. In our experiments, we evaluated our approach to be resilient to non-determinism and be consistent across multiple platforms and be effective against various binary packers. So first, a little bit of background knowledge. Binary packers are software used to commonly obfuscate malware in a term called packing. Roughly 80% of malware is packed, while 50% is simply repacked versions of the old malware. In fact, a long-standing challenge is unpacking malware. This is because to effectively unpack malware, it is tedious and time-consuming, but is necessary to study it, and it is also necessary when unleashing malware into the computer. In our study, we observed that an unpacking algorithm can dominate a CPU by 93 to 99%. This means bottlenecking is a common trait in unpacking. Then the features that we use to analyze our binaries are called hardware performance counters, and hardware performance counters are non-deterministic in nature. Actually, in hardware performance counter research, this non-determinism is only addressed in about 10% of it. So now the unpacking process. Binary packers first encode an executable through encryption or compression and attach an unpacking routine to the executable. As shown in this figure, when the packed version starts running, the unpacking routine first decodes the packed code and writes it into memory pages. After that, the execution flow will jump from the unpacking to the original entry point, which will resume malware payload execution. In this way, the actual unrecognizable malicious code stays unrecognizable to the system and malware analysts. And usually, they rely on static code features. Hardware performance counters are special registers found in the performance monitoring unit of a CPU. Hardware performance counters has a short name called HPCs. In this case, not high performance computing, but hardware performance counters. They are commonly used for performance monitoring and more importantly for detecting bottlenecks. However, they are known to be non-deterministic. Although hundreds of hardware events exist in a given processor, in our study, we actually selected 37 candidate events that are significant to the unpacking process. Generally, when studying malware, there is no causation between the malicious activities and hardware performance counters, and this is called a semantic gap. Yet, as you will see in our study and in the later slides, we were able to prove a causation between hardware events and a hardware unpacking process. So if non-determinism is not taken into account when using hardware performance counters, then the data, unfortunately, is wrong and inconsistent. The common issues hardware performance counters face is multiplexing, measuring across multiple cores, interrupt skid, measuring across multiple processes, and page faults. We do address this in our paper if you are interested in that. One non-deterministic event that I would like to discuss is the phenomenon called interrupt skid. This phenomenon occurs when an event is triggered and versus when the processor actually stops. In this figure on line 5, you can see matrix multiplication is occurring. And the expected hardware event is load here. And when we measure it without taking any alleviation to non-determinism, when we measure this load event, instead of 2,000, we actually only observe 152. if we use our loop-centric profiling, where we do account for the non-determinism, we can actually observe load events at 1,999. As you can see in our loop-centric HPC profiling, we were able to alleviate this interrupt skid. We were able to make our HPC values consistent, and instruction discrepancy can be accounted for within the loop. So on this slide, I present loop HPC, our loop HPC methodology. First, we take a packed malware, and then we interact with hardware features to monitor self-modifying code. Then we enable loop-centric profiling for each layer. Then we apply pre-trained machine learning classifiers to identify the original code in memory. At last, we perform a memory dump to deliver the impact malware. Loops are an essential structure for unpacking algorithms. Since this loop is a hotspot of a packed sample, we named this loop as hot loop. As an unpacking routine begins, it overwrites a memory area consisting of costly runtime iterations. So this figure on this slide shows two hot loop examples in popular packers UPX and TELock. As loops are an interprocedural structure, we can leverage this by detecting loops using hardware features. We explored this option due to the fact that many packware softwares can detect a binary instrumentation tool, which are commonly used to determine loops. To better prove our hot loop concept within an unpacking routine, we collected some performance data of hot loops in the unpacking routine of various off-the-shelf packers for the malware payload WannaCry. The performance data includes the number of max iterations, the percentage of instructions retired, and CPU cycles occupied. As indicated in this figure, hot loops are a hotspot of an unpacking routine. Since hot loop is an essential structure for unpacking, our first question is, how do we detect the loop using hardware features? Dynamically detecting a loop using dynamic binary instruction platforms is trivial. However, it is also trivial for a packer to detect whether it's running in a binary instrumentation tool. So this is what led us to study loops using hardware features. Here, last branch recorded, or LBR, is a hardware tracing feature offered by modern Intel processors. According to different CPU models, last branch recorded can record 16 or 32 most recent branch pairs into a register. The branch information includes address and target address of a branch, includes source address and target address of a branch. For example, there is a branch instruction at address 0x004-01054. And once the branch instruction gets executed, the CPU records the source address and target address of this branch into the LBR stack. A common heuristic to recognize a loop is the code region between a branch with a negative offset and its target. Our heuristic is that the loop is the code region between source address and target address in the LBR stack. If the target address is less than the source address, then we can see that a loop has occurred. LBR does have a limited size, however, and that's when we turn our attention to using hardware performance counters. With the help of hardware performance counters, we were able to store the LBR record to a user-defined memory space before it's full. Once we can detect a loop, we need to then detect the actual unpacking layers. So in this figure, first, the store event is corresponding to a write operation. We configure the store event to have a threshold set at 1. Under this configuration, an interrupt will be triggered for every store event. In the interrupt handle, we store the written addresses in a hash set data structure for future lookup. Second, to detect the then executed behavior that's commonly seen in multi-layer unpacking, we also configure the event branches with the threshold set at 1. When the first written basic block gets executed, an interrupt will be raised. In the interrupt handle, we look up the LBR's record, and we are able to see the branch source and target addresses. If the source address is an element of the hash set, we can determine that a written and then executed layer is detected. We then turn our attention to the next part of our study, which is actually determining the original code. And the steps we took were first to define the sum of loop-centric HPC values that occurred in each layer as a layer cost. Then we tagged the layer cost of each layer as the original code or not, as our first data set was made by we made our first data set. Then the third step is we use the tagged layer cost data set to train machine learning classifiers. We first tested our data set on a data set that included 586 Windows samples and 234 Linux samples. And then after that, we turned our attention to a large-scale classification of packed malware in the wild. So here we present our evaluation. We evaluated 29 off-the-shelf packers, and we conducted an experiment to compare our approach with existing unpacking methods such as CAPE, OLLI, and Erika. And the results showed that only loop HPC can succeed to unpack in all test cases. After training and testing on our known data set, as I said, we turned our attention to a wild malware data set, which included 74,938 samples. And this includes Windows malware, Linux malware, as well as low entropy malware. As you can see, we had success on both our known data set and then the large scale evaluation. We had 100% success rate of uncovering the unpacked malware in our known data set. However, we only had 96.5% success rate in the wild packed malware data set. So what we saw, the discrepancy between the known data set and the wild packed malware data set, we saw that the smaller samples of the wild packed malware data set failed due to the fact that the smaller samples actually do not reveal hotspots. Although the loop HPCs is able to unpack effectively, we still had to consider how a skilled attacker could circumvent loop HPC. And we have discussed the various possible attacks, so please see our paper for countermeasures. However, some of the possible attacks that could occur to loop HPC include a detection attack, time-based attack, hiding hot loop, mimicry attack, and fake hot loop. If you have any questions, please connect with some of my colleagues, Binlin, Cheng, or Jiang, Ming. Of course, you can reach out to me directly through the Slack channel. And thank you, that is my presentation.